Well, welcome everyone to Sources of Justice. My name is Danny Diaz, and I'm honored to be joined by my colleague Amparo Chavez Gonzalez, and we both are from the UCLA History Geography Project. And today we are really excited to have with us Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who will be giving a talk on her new book, Bad Mexicans. So we just want to let you know before we get into this that Sources of Justice is funded by the Library of Congress, Teaching with Primary Sources project. And this is actually a collaborative effort. So Sources of Justice is being co-hosted by the various California History Social Science projects. And so today is the UCLA History Geography Project's turn. And like I said earlier, we're thrilled about today's topic, and we're happy that you all are here joining us today. Before we get into our inclusion warm-up activity, we would like to ask you to rename yourself. There are some handy directions on the slide in front of you. Right. So if you click on the top right, then you can let us know which breakout rooms you would like to be in when we have time for discussion. All right. If anybody has questions about how to do this, please drop them in the chat. One of us will respond with some assistance. A little bit about our agenda today. In a second, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Amparo, who's going to walk you through an intro activity. From there, we're going to hand it over to Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez. After the talk from Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez, we'll have a Q&A where you'll get to ask her some follow-up questions. And then from there, we'll have some small group discussion where we'll be able to unpack some of the content and some of the sources that were shared and think about application to our classrooms. And then we will close things out and remind you about our supplemental teacher workshop that goes with today's Scholar Talk. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic to my colleague Amparo.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as a land-grant institution, the History Geography Project at UCLA acknowledges the Tamba Gabrielino peoples as the traditional caretakers of the unceded land originally known as Tvangar, which today would be considered the LA Basin to the Southern Channel Islands. And as people who live there, we want to honor them as the original caretakers of this land. So in a moment, we're going to read a quote, and then we are also going to watch a video. It's a short clip. And as you watch these, we would like you to think about the 3 questions that are on your screen. What is the role of journalism in any nation? Should journalists be expected to be or not be activists? And do journalists help preserve or further democracy? And I have a typo, I apologize. So Daniel, if you could click, here's our quote. The quote says, "Journalists are simply leftists disguised as reporters. They are political activists disguised as reporters. Rush Limbaugh." Okay, the next slide. This is an ad that came out in the Super Bowl. I've put the words on the screen if you would like to read, and we're also going to play the ad from the Super Bowl. And Daniel, if you could play it, and then large screen.
When we go off to war, when we exercise our rights, when we soar to our greatest heights, when we mourn and pray, when our neighbors are at risk, when our nation is threatened, there's someone to gather the facts, to bring you the story, no matter the cost. Because knowing empowers us. Knowing helps us decide. Knowing keeps us free.
In the chat, write your thinking about these 3 questions, right? What should the role of journalism in any nation be? What expectations, right? Should we have that journalists be neutral? And what is the role of media in preserving or furthering democratic ideals? So you could take a couple moments and put that in the chat. So I see someone saying that these 2, the clip and the quote are talking to them about speaking truth to power. And then someone else spoke about that journalists need to be the eyes and ears of a nation. Without free information, how is a government of or for the people supposed to run? I also see Dan put that journalists keep those in power in check. And then that while journalism should be neutral, there should be room for activists, muckrakers, and free and balanced media. Thank you. And all of that is a pillar of democracy. I see another comment about journalists hold people, the government, and citizens accountable. Jason put that journalists have a responsibility to advocate for those who are not empowered to make inquiries themselves. I see that journalists should tell various points of view, but also question those points of view, which is a wonderful way to think about, right? In our classrooms, how do we teach multiple points of view, and how do journalists do that themselves and still interrogate their own sources? Those of you who are high school teachers, I can put in the chat, there's a journalism code of ethics, which speaks to that journalists should have various sources and still be open and willing to interrogate those sources for their validity, right? So that's an important piece. And then Edgar put in that opinions are important, but they have to be free and true. And Nancy also shared with us that journalism is an institution, right? Which is another way for us to think about this, that it's absolutely necessary for democracy to thrive and sustain, and that the individual actions of journalists can complicate the story or what they're sharing many times. Thank you, everyone. These are so, you're making me think a lot now. I also see Nicole sharing that journalism is essential for democracy. It's a critical advocate to educate the citizenry about local and national and global affairs, and that journalists must abide by a shared standard of ethics that requires them to report using evidence, our favorite word in history, social studies, from a variety of sources and perspectives. Wonderful. Yeah, I see more coming in. Woo, people are now getting going there. Wonderful, right? There's an important role for activist journalists in a democracy. And at the same time, there is an important role for more unbiased and neutral reporting. And I think it is important that journalists and publications are very clear about their intentions in each piece, right? Talking a little bit about that positionality and making it clear to those reading where as a reporter may be coming from. Okay, so for example, labeling an editorial or commentary piece. Thank you, EM. And then Stacy shared that journalists should be careful to present direct perspectives, but also effectively question and challenge those that are not telling the truth or are spreading misinformation, not equating all perspectives as equally valid if they are not based on facts. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Well, this got us going and thinking, right, about the role of journalists, the role of activists, and where do they intersect? Where are they connected? And what does it mean to do this when there are a lot of social movements happening at the same time? So without me continuing to get excited about your quotes, I'm going to pass it back to Danny so that we can get to our main speaker.
Thank you, Amparo. And I think you'll find shortly that this conversation about journalism is definitely relevant and pertinent to the talk you're about to hear. So it's my honor to introduce you all to Kelly Lytle Hernandez. She is a professor of history, African American studies, and urban planning at UCLA, where she holds the Thomas E. Lifka Endowed Chair in History. She's also the director of the Ralph J. Bunche Center for African American Studies. She is one of the nation's leading experts on race, immigration, and mass incarceration. Professor Lytle Hernandez is the author of the award-winning books Migra, A History of U.S. Border Patrol from 2010, and City of Inmates, Conquest, Rebellion, and the Rise of Human Caging in Los Angeles, 2017. And her recent book, which she's going to talk about today, Bad Mexicans, Race, Empire, and Revolution in the Borderlands, which was published this year. Currently, Professor Lytle Hernandez is, excuse me, let me take that back. She is the principal investigator for $1 Million Hoods, a university-based community drive research project that maps the fiscal and human cost of mass incarceration in Los Angeles. For her leadership of $1 Million Hoods, Professor Lytle Hernandez has won numerous awards, including the 2018 Local Hero Award from KCET PBS, a 2018 Freedom Now Award from the Los Angeles Community Action Network, and the 2019 Catalyst Award from the South LA Parent Student Advocacy Organization CADRE, or CADRE. For her historical and contemporary work, Professor Lytle Hernandez has been named a MacArthur Genius Fellow and a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians. She is also an elected member of the Society of American Historians and the Pulitzer Prize Board, and she is our faculty advisor for the UCLA History Geography Project. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it to Dr. Lytle Hernandez. Let's give her a round of applause with your emoji buttons.
Very cool. Thank you for the introduction. Hi, everybody. This is good to be with you this afternoon, all my favorite people, history teachers. We've got about, hour 15 or so for us to talk about this history of immigrants and politics and organizing and how we can teach some of these stories in our classroom. So what I'm going to do today, in a second, I'll share my screen. But first of all, I'll give you a snapshot of who this book is about. It's about a group of Mexican immigrants from the turn of the 20th century known as the Magonistas. I'll give you a quick snapshot of who they were. Then we'll talk about how the story fits into US history and why it matters. And then I want to take you a little bit deeper into the story of the Magonistas, tell you more about them, read a little bit from this new book that is going to be published on May 10th. So this is a little bit of a sneak peek for something that's not quite out yet. All right. So let me share my screen. Yeah, perfect. Okay, good. Okay, so this book, Bad Mexicans, tells the story of a group of Mexican dissidents who came to the United States in the early 20th century, 1904 in particular, to try to stir up a rebellion against the dictator back in Mexico. And that dictator's name was Porfirio Diaz. Now, the dissidents, known as Magonistas, or as Porfirio Diaz liked to call them, Bad Mexicans. They were journalists in particular, but they grew a social movement that had miners and cotton pickers and migrant workers and many people in their motley crew. They left Mexico and crossed the US-Mexico border into Laredo, Texas in January of 1904. And within days of arriving, they noticed that they were being followed everywhere by Diaz's spies. So they picked up and they moved to San Antonio and then St. Louis, where they were able to relaunch their dissident newspaper, Regeneración. They were able to establish a political party called the PLM, El Partido Liberal Mexicano, and they even started an army from St. Louis. Now in 1906, this PLM army raided the small town of Jimenez, Mexico. And the Jimenez raid stoked fear across the United States. That's because under Diaz's reign, US investors had a major stake in Diaz's Mexico. By 1910, foreign investors, namely US investors, owned about 1/4 of the Mexican land base. And US investors in particular dominated key Mexican industries from railroads to mining and more. So the Jimenez raid frightened US investors because it suggested that Porfirio Diaz could not control politics, and he, most important, couldn't protect their investments in Mexico. So following that raid, the United States government, including the US Department of War, the US Department of Treasury, the Immigration Service, the US Marshals, a range of police officers and sheriff's deputies across the country, and a bevy of spies, worked with the Mexican government, the Diaz regime in particular, to try to suppress the Magonista movement here in the United States and in Mexico. In particular, they wanted to suppress it before they could start a revolution against Diaz in Mexico. So between 1906 and 1910, all of these US government agencies worked with the Mexican government to either extradite, deport, imprison, and in some cases even kidnap scores of Mexican revolutionaries across the borderlands. But it didn't work. The Magonistas persevered. They outran and they outsmarted the cross-border counterinsurgency team. And by 1910, the Magonistas had organized 4 armed raids into Mexico from Texas. And they had stirred and incited the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution, which would go on to oust Porfirio Diaz from power. So this book, Bad Mexicans, tells the story of the Magonistas and their revolt and the US-Mexico counterinsurgency campaign that failed to stop them. It's a really dramatic tale with tyrants and rebels and spies and secret codes and love affairs. It's extraordinary. It's really cinematic. It's also at the heart of the story, really important ideas about justice, about plenty for the impoverished, power for the marginalized, and land for the dispossessed. These were thinkers, these were intellectuals, these are politicians. And I was first drawn to this story way back in graduate school about 20 years ago when I was in a Mexican history course, and I read a couple paragraphs about the Magonistas in a book. I didn't know much more about them at that time, but I was hooked and I was fascinated by this extraordinary tale of really ordinary people who took on the US and Mexican governments and won. But I was also curious that why was it I had never heard about the Magonistas before? I'm from the border. I grew up in San Diego, California. I consider myself a borderlander, but all throughout my youth, and it wasn't until I got in graduate school that I learned this incredible story. So I went on to write a dissertation and do other books, but the Magonistas had their hook in me, and I continued to read all that I could about them. And a lot of scholars have written about the Magonistas. They've published in English and Spanish and many languages. They've done books and websites and articles. It really is a small library of scholarship dedicated to the Magonistas. And if you go to Mexico, the story is iconic, legendary, very well known. It's just not well known here in the United States. And I have been dismayed that more people here in the United States don't know the Magonista story. And it's often treated, well, it's often tucked into the corners of Mexican-American history, which itself is so poorly known in the United States, right? But I knew that the Magonista story struck at the heart of US history. I just had to take a little time to figure out how. And so I spent about 20 years thinking about writing this book and how the Magonistas fit into the center of the American narrative. So let's talk about that now, how these Magonistas fit into the American story. First of all, the Magonistas rebelled against a dictator in Mexico, but that dictator's reign grew under the wing of US empire. And in fact, US empire took its very first steps in Diaz's Mexico. So I'm sure some of you teachers out there who have used this image before when you talk about manifest destiny. And you probably talk about how the United States government spent the 19th century charging across the North American continent in search of new lands for its white citizens to occupy. And they were ginned up on this fantasy, this racial fantasy called manifest destiny, that they, the arriving Anglo-American settlers, were to dispossess in the indigenous communities and replace them on the land and dominate all land and life in the region. That's the basic concept of manifest destiny. And by the mid-19th century, the US settler state, also known as the white man's republic, began to seriously consider a new form of imperialism. And what that was economic and political domination without territorial acquisition. This is really important. So as we finish the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1876, a lot of people start to look up and say, what's next? And one of the first places they look is down into Mexico. And they begin this new form of expansion. Saying, well, we don't want the actual land and governance. We just want to invest in Mexico. They start that under Diaz's rule when he takes power by coup d'etat in 1876. And he goes on to rule Mexico until 1911 with extraordinary support from the United States. So that's one thing about the Magonistas. Their story, their uprising against Diaz is an uprising against the earliest chapter of US empire. The second thing is that during his reign, Diaz invited foreign investors to buy land, to extract resources, to use labor without directly assuming control over territorial governance in Mexico. By 1910, some of the most important industrialists, robber barons, were all invested in Mexico. And if they didn't make their fortune in Mexico, they certainly amplified it there. And so you have oil barons and all sorts of investors, some of them listed here, who make or double their fortunes in Mexico. And some people, even like William Randolph Hearst, whose family owned more than 1 million acres in Mexico, began to wonder aloud, I really don't see what is to prevent us from owning all of Mexico and running it to suit ourselves. And we have to say that under Diaz's reign, that's basically what they did. So the early US empire, the laboratory of US empire, is happening in Mexico. And the Magonistas rebellion against that empire is one of the ways that their story fits into US history. Another way is that the rise of US empire, what some people call the integration of the US and Mexican economies, triggered the rise of mass labor migration between Mexico and the United States. So prior to these investments, the Mexican population was relatively settled, not migrating to the United States. It is the investments that triggers mass labor migration. And the violence of the Mexican Revolution in 1910 only furthers that flow. And so by the 1920s, Mexican migrants would become the principal labor force of the American West, which is rising in power during this time period. But also this origin story of mass migration from Mexico is transforming the entire United States and its demographics in particular. By 1980, Mexicans would become the largest immigrant group arriving in the United States, ending Europe's long dominance in the US immigration story. By 2010, more immigrants would arrive from Mexico than any other country in US history. And Latinos led by Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants constitute now soon the largest non-white population in the United States. And it's estimated that by 2045, at the latest, the United States will be a minority white population with Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants at the lead. So what's important here is we have the origin story of the making of the modern American population. And the rise of US empire and the outbreak of the 1910 Mexican Revolution are seminal events in US history, but we don't talk about them. They both changed who we are as a people. and therefore they are part of our story. But Mexico's immigrants, right, were not Mexico's labor migrants were not America's immigrants, and their arrival en masse at the beginning of the 20th century opened a new field of race and iniquity in the United States. Since the US-Mexico War, 1846 to 1848, Anglo-Americans had largely regarded persons of Mexican descent as a conquered, a mixed race population slotted by manifest destiny to serve settler citizens and fuel their industries or disappear. So migrating from job to job across the American West, Mexico's labor migrants built the region's industry, really fueled the rise of the American West, while running headfirst into a web of white supremacy. They confronted low wages, dangerous working conditions, residential segregation, racial violence, and a racially biased immigration regime that was just coming into formation, amounting in totality to what scholars call Juan Crow, right? A derivative of Jim Crow that is specific to the Southwestern United States. So in fact, this book about a revolution in Mexico begins with the story of a lynching in Texas. So what I want to do now is read to you the first 4 paragraphs from this new book, Bad Mexicans. Okay, the introduction. We stand between. They lit the pyre and they watched him burn. Antonio Rodriguez, a 20-year-old ranch hand, murdered a white woman, they said. White men from nearby farms formed a posse to track him down, while the other residents of Rock Springs, Texas, some 400 of them, met at the edge of town and piled kindling at the base of a mesquite tree. The posse soon arrived with a cowboy in the lead, dragging Rodriguez by a lasso looped around his neck. The mob laughed as they chained Antonio to the tree and doused him in kerosene. Someone threw a match, and 30 minutes later, when Antonio Rodriguez was dead, the residents of Rock Springs, quote, returned quietly to town and business was resumed. It was November 3rd, 1910. Mexican-American journalists in the US-Mexico borderlands reported the grisly details of Rodriguez's murder, condemning it as an act of racial terror akin to the lynching of African-Americans in the South. Newspapers in Mexico picked up the story. Quote, lynching is not practiced by the blonde Yankee, except upon beings whom, for ethnic reasons, he considers his inferiors, fumed the editors of Mexico City's El Debate. Another paper dubbed Anglo-Americans the, quote, barbarous whites of the North, deriding them as giants of the dollar, but pygmies of culture. There is indignation among Mexicans here over this lynching, reported El País. By November 8, 1910, riots had erupted across Mexico. Targeting the considerable number of US-owned businesses and homes, the protesters smashed windows and tore down American flags while chanting, "Mueren los Yankees," death to the Americans. The police arrested hundreds of people. In one case, officers drew sabers and descended upon a crowd, killing one man by stabbing him through the neck. The protests continued on the streets and in the press, prompting Henry Lane Wilson, the US ambassador to Mexico, to issue a public warning. The United States will, quote, leave nothing undone to protect US citizens and property in Mexico. It was a threat. The United States would invade Mexico, but attacks on US interests did not cease. The protests raged on. Ambassador Wilson decided to visit General Porfirio Diaz, the dictator of Mexico, to insist that he put a stop to the so-called anti-American disturbances. So those are the opening paragraphs from Bad Mexicans, and the United States wanted an end to these anti-American disturbances triggered by this lynching in Mexico, but it was too late. By November 1910, the Magonistas had sowed the seeds for mass revolt in Mexico. So now let's turn to talk a little bit more about these folks, the Magonistas. Who were they? They were an extraordinary, diverse group of rebels. Librado Rivera here was a school teacher. He was a reserved, quiet, learned man. He never really said much. He was often the quietest person in the room. His friends dubbed him El Fakir for his quiet, ascetic way. Juana Belém Gutierrez de Mendoza was this extraordinary cross-dressing autodidact from the mountains of Durango, who became a vocal advocate for minors. She was arrested numerous times in Mexico, and rather than sign her name, she would simply write on the jail forms in the place of her name, sedition and rebellion. Juana was no joke. She would go on after or during the revolution to join Emiliano Zapata's rebel forces and actually helped co-write and ghostwrite his Plan de Ayala. Another person is Antonio Villarreal, who was a literature professor who once did time in Mexico for a duel. And the rumor is that that duel was over a literary dispute. There are many, many other rebels in this story. This is just 3 of them, but they all have their own extraordinary tales to tell. But at the center of it all was this person, Ricardo Flores Magón, whose favorite pen name was El Scorpio, right? The scorpion. He was a journalist who looked more like sort of a heavyset professor than a revolutionary. He was charismatic, he was didactic, he was brave, he was bold, he was also vitriolic, right? And whoever did not follow him on his path on ever increasing radicalism, he would strike out against them. So there's a story about the relationships amongst these rebels, not just between them and the dictator. But Ricardo was the leading voice of this newspaper, Regeneración, which was first published in Mexico City. And on the pages of Regeneración, he would say things that nobody else dared to say, right? Remember, this is a dictatorship. And he'd write things like, General Diaz has killed democracy. Well, first of all, General Diaz didn't like to be called General Diaz. He liked to be called like a patron or something like that. He didn't like it to be pointed out that he was a military general in this sense over democracy. Ricardo would write things like Diaz is authoritarian and despotic, right? So this is not a democracy. And he would say things like Diaz had made Mexicans the quote servants of foreigners with all these foreign investors who were coming in to Mexico. He also would say, okay, if you don't understand that the Diaz regime is a dictatorship, that's because the government press funded by Diaz is a quote social intoxicant that perverts public opinion, making us think that our absolute monarchy is a democratic republic. Again, remember, you've got a general in the presidency who is a dictator, and he's just, Ricardo doesn't care. He will say whatever is on his mind and whatever his interpretation is of the facts on the ground. When Diaz threatens them by spreading a rumor that they are public enemies, right, which is a way that he wanted to make them be quiet, they write on the pages of Regeneración, we are not revolutionary, but we will be if Diaz's tyranny doesn't stop. Well, guess what? It didn't stop. And so for such words and positions, Diaz had Flores Magón and his colleagues arrested numerous times in Mexico, smashed their printing presses, and even banned every newspaper in Mexico from printing or publishing any of their words. And it was at this moment in 1903, when they were muzzled in Mexico, that the Magonistas, the journalists amongst them, left Mexico City and came to the United States, entering into the small town of Laredo, Texas. Let's see here. So in the Laredo, they settled among the large number of Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans in South Texas, a region known as the Brown Belt during this time period for how many Mexicans and Mexican Americans lived there. But within weeks of their arrival, they noticed that Diaz's spies was following them everywhere. So they moved to San Antonio and then St. Louis. And then they began living on the run as fugitives in the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere. Still, by 1906, the Magonistas were able to relaunch their newspaper, Regeneración, from St. Louis. They were able to establish the political party, the Partido Liberal Mexicano, PLM. And they recruited an army, and here's a credential here of one of the PLM fighters who was recruited into the PLM army. And in 1906, following a deadly labor strike at an American-owned mine in Cananea, Mexico, the PLM publicly vowed on the pages of Regeneración and in a manifesto that they distributed across the United States and Mexico They publicly vowed to launch an armed revolt in Mexico within 1 year's time. The manifesto, which I believe is one of your documents that we gave you for this presentation, was extraordinary. It announced the goals of the PLM revolt, and those goals included everything from protecting voting rights to establishing a minimum wage, prohibiting child labor, eliminating debt servitude, and probably most important, returning land to families dispossessed by Diaz and foreign investors. And so the United States was extraordinarily alarmed by this manifesto that is circulating throughout the borderlands. And even President Theodore Roosevelt ordered the US Department of War to, quote, go to the utmost limit in proceeding against these so-called revolutionists. And they had just 1 year to shut this revolution down. So by the summer of 1906, the borderlands were on lockdown with soldiers, US Marshals, and vigilantes all on patrol, looking to arrest Magonistas and thwart their revolt. Still, the PLM army, recruited among cotton pickers and miners and migrant workers, were ready to fight. Now, Danny, did you want to pause and talk about one of these documents, or should we keep going?
Yeah, I think if you think that this is, I think this is a good time for a discussion. But it's really up to you, Dr. Lytle Hernandez. If you want to keep going, can keep going.
Okay, we'll keep going, and then you all can decide what document you want to talk about. Okay, y'all, so this is what happened next. You ready? It's extraordinary. So on September 26th of 1906, this grandfather, Juan Jose Arredondo, led 60 PLM fighters on an armed raid on Jimenez, Mexico from Texas. It was a pre-dawn raid. By noon, they had locked up the mayor and other officials in jail and declared Jimenez to be free from Diaz's rule. But when Juan Jose Arredondo and the 60 other PLM fighters rode out of town, someone let the mayor out of jail, and the mayor called the military, who chased the Magonistas fighters across the region. They had a shootout at a local ranch, but most of the rebel fighters made their way back across the border into the United States, which they thought would be safe harbor, but it was not. Infuriated by the Jimenez raid and all of the doubts that it triggered about his power, Diaz sent more Mexican spies to infiltrate the PLM and ordered Mexican consular officials to work with United States agents to arrest, extradite, deport, or kidnap as many Magonistas as possible. The regime also hired the Thomas Furlong Secret Service Agency to hunt down Ricardo Flores Magón and any of the Magonistas. Now here's another extraordinary character. So Thomas Furlong was like one of those scrappy spy men from St. Louis. And he was always trying to hustle contracts for the Pinkertons, which is this much larger, more established organization. One of Furlong's most significant contributions to this cross-border counterinsurgency campaign against the Magonistas was his ability to penetrate the US postal system. What he did is he either planted spies or he paid off postal workers to open up the rebels' mail, copy down their letters, and then put the letter back in the mail and send it on its way. And he would use these copied letters, stolen correspondence, to try to hunt the Magonistas wherever they were living and hiding across the United States, Canada, and Mexico. He put the letters back into the mail, hoping that the Magonistas wouldn't figure out that they were being watched, right? And then the trail would stay hot. But the Magonistas did figure out that their letters were arriving what they said as violada. And they started to write in ciphers and secret codes and use pseudonyms and send all their letters through at least 6 carriers before it got to their final destination. So you have here one of the PLM's letters written in a secret code. And I believe we provided with you the code key for this letter, so your students can actually break the code of this letter and what it says. And it's a letter between 2 of the rebels that was stolen by Furlong's men. They were able to use, but Furlong was still able to use these stolen letters to arrest Juan Jose Arredondo and the Jimenez raiders across Texas, holding them for extradition. They were able to use these stolen letters to track Magonistas across Arizona. And actually, the very first mass deportation of Mexicans from the United States is of a group of Magonistas being deported out of southern Arizona in 1906 following Jimenez raid. They used those letters to track down Ricardo Flores Magón and other movement leaders. And actually, oh, hold on, I gave you something too soon. Forget that slide, you didn't see that slide. I wanna read something to you. What I want to read to you is another piece of the book in which Thomas Furlong is using these stolen letters to track the rebels. And here you get a sense of how close Furlong is able to get to them, but also the level of intimacy that is in some of these letters. It's not all just revolution, it's also the relationships between the rebels. So you ready? Okay. Quote, "We knew Rivera's whereabouts continuously from the time he left St. Louis," boasted Furlong. By January 1907, Furlong had tracked Rivera to Texas, where he had connected with the PLM gunrunner Antonio de Pio Araujo, whom Mexican and US operatives identified as using a string of pseudonyms and code names in PLM correspondence. In a letter Araujo mailed at 3:30 a.m. from Waco, Texas, he wrote about how busy he had been collecting, quote, dulces y escobas for a raid on Matamoros, just across the border from Brownsville. Now, in PLM speak, dulces y escobas, right? Candies and brooms is really guns and dynamite. And he had already stashed 14 carbines, 1,600 cartridges, and 60 sticks of dynamite in the provisional barracks under the floorboards of an old ranch house outside of Del Rio, Texas. There was another stash in a cave about 10 miles away. Quote, "The hour of vengeance is near," wrote Araujo. "The revolution will not wait another month. We go to victory or death." While waiting for Ricardo Flores Magón to issue the signal to attack, the fighters looked for work in and around Del Rio. But Flores Magón never sent the signal. Remember, Flores Magón is on the run at this point. He had nixed the Matamoros raid, writing, quote, "It's my opinion that we should not begin the movement. We need to first notify our comrades throughout the Republic of the instructions you already have so they can prepare themselves, so they can be ready to fight. And when enough of us are ready, then we will begin the movements at once, at all points." With the Matamoros raid on hold, Rivera began moving about with no clear pattern, mailing increasingly desperate dispatches from isolated locations. Under the pseudonym Lionel, he wrote from Denver, quote, "I'm on the verge of being apprehended. I leave here tomorrow morning. Do not write anymore. I still do not know if I can escape." He then walked 33 miles through rain and snow, arriving in Colorado Springs with his feet, quote, "full of sores." All he could afford to eat was a cup of coffee and a bit of bread. "Esto es todo." That's it, he added. Alone and broke and worried that spies were following him everywhere, he begged his friends to send him funds to survive, explaining that he could not look for work. "If you have a peso or two, send me whatever you can." Pennies and dollars arrived from comrades across the United States and Mexico. Still, in May 1907, Rivera reported that he was in as desperate a situation as could be imagined: sin dinero, perseguido y sin trabajo, without money, pursued, without work. Although he was starving, Rivera, the quiet teacher from San Luis Potosí, refused to give up, remaining committed to the PLM and its cause. Rivera's wife felt differently. Back in St. Louis, Concepcion or Conchita Rivera had given birth to their third child, a baby girl named Teresita. Whenever possible, Rivera mailed her money, which she shared with the other PLM families in the city. Manuel Sarabia, Tomas Sarabia, and Ricardo Flores Magón all sent money to the families in St. Louis, and the women evenly split every dollar that arrived. But it was never enough. As she struggled to feed her children, Conchita Rivera's letters to her husband grew increasingly tense. "I make $1 or $2 every week, but the work tires me and the baby won't let me be." She wanted Rivera to know how difficult her life was without his help. "You should know that you left me in disgrace with my children. I am suffering without respite," she continued. She was thinking about returning home to Mexico without him, she wrote. "I want you to understand that I cannot live here. Let me leave. There it will be easier for me to raise my children. I am confident that they, the government officials, will not harm me. And she had already consulted Rivera's mother on the matter, and his mother agreed. Quote, son, it is time for you to quit all this with your ideas of revolution for yourself, for your poor wife, for your innocent children, and for your inconsolable mother, she wrote in a blistering letter from Mexico. We have already suffered so much, and what have you gained? Not much. Think about it. What if something happens to you, God forbid, if your enemies catch you? What will happen to your family, to your unfortunate children, your inconsolable wife, and your mother, who already suffers from your capriciousness? No, son, think about it good and figure out how to escape the clutches of Porfirio Diaz. She wanted him to quit the campaign, but Rivera chose to stick with the PLM and kept moving, always staying just one step ahead of Furlong's men. So that's an example of some of the content that we get from these extraordinary letters that were stolen by Thomas Furlong. They're chasing them, Rivera staying just one step ahead, but in August of 1907, Furlong tracked Rivera along Antonio Villarreal and Ricardo Flores Magón to shack at the edge of downtown Los Angeles on Pico Boulevard. And with several detectives from the LAPD, Furlong spies kicked in the door and brawled with the rebels for nearly an hour, with dishes crashing and furniture smashing. It spills out into the street, and people start to watch. But the agents best the rebels, and they drag them through the streets to the LA City Jail, where they spend the next 3 years in jail or in prison. And at this point, Furlong and the Mexican government expected the Magonistas' revolution to end. If Ricardo Flores Magón, known as El Alma de Todo, right, the heart of the revolution, if he's in prison, everything's got to stop, right? Well, they were wrong about that. The Magonistas' rebellion only grew while Ricardo Flores Magón was in prison. 3 guesses. How did it grow? I'll tell you. I bet you know the women, right? We're at the center of the story. Women like Maria Bruce de Talavera and Conchita Rivera held the movement together. How did they do it? Well, Bruce, Ricardo's life partner, smuggled letters to him in and out of the LA city and the county jail that you see here. How did she do this? She would drop off his clothes at the jail, say, oh, I'm a kindly woman, and I wanted to bring him clean clothes and clean underwear that he could wear. Well, she had written on tiny little pieces of paper, rebel correspondence, and rolled it up and then sewed it into the seams of his underwear and his pants. He would take the clean clothes, pick out the rebel correspondence, put his own back in, and she would come back to the jail and say, oh, I'm here to pick up his dirties, right? And this way they had rebel correspondence going in and out of the jail. There were other things that they did. Furlong's men caught on to this ruse and were able to capture some of those letters, which are in an archive in Mexico City, but they didn't capture all of them. And they also didn't see when Ricardo Flores Magón slipped to Maria a note during visiting hours one time. She tucked the note into her purse and rushed out the jail and took it immediately to a PLM safe house in LA. And she handed it over to a PLM fighter named Praxedis Guerrero, where he read the note, which included Ricardo's call for a new set of armed raids on Mexico. And he immediately left for Texas. Now let's talk about Praxedis Guerrero. So Praxedis Guerrero, you see here, was a really unlikely Magonista. He was this blonde scion of a wealthy family in Guanajuato. He grew up with private tutors and writing poetry and winning equestrian competitions. But as a young man, he renounced his family's wealth and he fled Mexico and came to the United States to live, as so many Mexicans were beginning to do, as a low-wage migrant worker. He worked, in Colorado, in San Francisco, but in particular in the mines in southern Arizona, where he met up with a PLM recruiter and immediately joined the PLM. And he emerged as an eloquent writer. Now, while Ricardo Flores Magón would write these diatribes, right? They're hard to translate because they're like 2-3 paragraphs long as any singular sentence, and they're really dense. Praxedis really mastered what you call like the Twitter format of the early 20th century, these short, punchy, pithy quotes that people could use through oral tradition and share across the borderlands. He said things like, if you believe that you will not reach freedom by walking, then run. Sow a small seed of rebelliousness and you will reap a harvest of freedoms. Justice is neither bought nor requested as a handout. If it does not yet exist, it is made. And one of the more famous quotes from the Mexican Revolution, it's better to die on your feet than to live on your knees, is an old anarchist slogan, but it's brought to the Mexican Revolution by Praxis Guerrero and by Ricardo Flores Magon. Okay, so with Praxis in the lead, the PLM leads 3 stunningly lethal and significant armed raids into Mexico in June of 1908. It's all over the news. Here in the United States, across the country, and around the world, people start to ask, oh my God, is the Porfirio Diaz regime coming to an end? Can he really contain this uprising? This is just a couple of the headlines from the summer of 1908. Now, what's also significant about the summer of 1908, namely, so these raids happened between June 25th and June 28th, more or less, of 1908. Well, on July 1st of 1908, the United States Department of Justice establishes a brand new police department called the Bureau of Investigation. This is what's going to go on to become the FBI. The Bureau of Investigation instructed its new agents to crush the Magonistas' revolt. Thwarting the Mexican Revolution was one of the FBI's very first big cases. So a swirl of arrests follow across the country with the new FBI, US Marshals, cops, and deputies. Everyone is in furlong, is in on this game. Magonistas were swept up across the United States and largely imprisoned at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas. But it was really too late. By 1910, the Magonistas had sowed the seeds of insurgency, and Mexico was en route to revolution. And here's just some wonderful photos of PLM members and affiliates who were swept up during this campaign. These are all mugshots of when they were arrested and put into federal prison here. There are many, many more. And the first agent who was in charge of tracking down the Magonistas was this man named Joe Priest. And he reported that he always had the understanding that all this work should be kept from the public press. So in some ways, if you don't know about the Magonistas, it was because they tried to not have you know about them. Now, it was too late. Mexico was en route to revolution. So in November of 1910, not long after the lynching of Antonio Rodriguez in Texas, the Mexican Revolution officially began. Ricardo Flores Magon and the Magonistas did not lead the revolution's major battles. It was really, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, other legends that we know from the revolution who led those battles. The Magonistas really were too poor to put together an army to lay siege to Diaz. And also Ricardo was an anarchist, an avowed anarchist by 1910, 1911. And he believed that as long as he could spark an uprising, the people would rise up with him. He was wrong about that. Francisco Madero, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, and others took the revolution through its fighting phase. But it's really important to note that Ricardo Flores Magon and the Magonistas had gotten them there. They had sowed the seeds of that potential. Now, one of the things that's so significant about the Mexican Revolution that scholars have talked about often is that the Mexican Revolution was the world's first social revolution of the 20th century. It's where a non-white debtor nation rises up against the world, really, the world of investors. For the Magonistas to sow these seeds of revolt, they had to thrash against the interlocking cords of empire, white supremacy, and capitalism in the United States at the dawn of the 20th century. And they had to force some of the most powerful people on earth, right? Teddy Roosevelt, the Guggenheims, many others, force them to contend with the dreams and the demands of Mexico's dispossessed. What's important to note here is the Magonistas, ordinary people, migrants, many of them undocumented, cotton pickers and miners, they made history. In particular, they made US history. They did it on both sides of the border. And while they're legends in Mexico, I would argue that it's important that we here in the United States know their tale too. Not only does the Magonista story of revolution from the borderlands make clear how Mexico and Mexicans are central to US history, but their motley band of migrant rebels, including intellectuals and cotton pickers and many more, played a major role in defining the world in which we live by defying the world in which they lived. So thank you. That is a rundown of the book, and I look forward to chatting with you all about it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lytle Hernandez. So you all can give a round of applause if you want to clap or hit the emoji button. But we definitely have time for some questions, and I'm guessing we have quite a bit. So feel free to unmute if you'd like, or you could drop the question in the chat and one of us can read it for you. Well, I don't mind starting. I have a question. I'm curious about the context of the Red Scare in all of this, and sort of wondering if you can talk to perhaps the connection between this story and that phenomenon that was happening in the US during the 1920s.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Red Scare happens, shortly after World War I, right? And leads into the early 1920s. And it's a campaign of police enforced political suppression. The Bureau of Investigation and the Immigration Service play particularly important roles. And we know that this is the time when immigrant organizers like Emma Goldman get swept up and removed from the country, but Eugene Debs and many other socialists and radicals, labor unionists get picked up and imprisoned in Leavenworth Prison. Ricardo Flores Magón is also incarcerated during this time period, and it's actually goes on to be his final term of imprisonment at Leavenworth, where he dies at Leavenworth in November of 1922, while he's being imprisoned there with many of these organizers who were swept up during the Red Scare. So the question for me, and maybe for you as history teachers, is why have we never been told that there was this really important group of Mexican immigrants who were a part of this story? We've always really, let's be honest, talked about European immigrants and white labor organizers. Sometimes if you're lucky, you're in the right class, you're reading the right book, you'll get some Black organizers, right? But very rarely are we exposed to the history of non-white immigrant groups, API, Latinx, who were being swept up at the intersection of immigration control and political suppression by the police. And the Magonistas are a part of that story. So Ricardo Flores Magón goes on to die at Leavenworth in 2022. And here I should note, one indicator of how important Ricardo Flores Magón and the Magonista movement is in Mexico is that just a couple of months ago in January, the Mexican federal government declared 2022 to be the year of Ricardo Flores Magón, right? It's 100 years from his death. And so the entire nation is remembering, yes, Ricardo Flores Magón in particular, but the entire Magonistas movement. And again, somehow you hit that border and it's like a border of knowledge. There certainly are people who know about the Magonistas, but not enough, not in terms of how important they were. They shut down the borderlands. They forced Roosevelt and others to contend with them. I just would like to have more people know their story.
We have a question in the chat, and that question is from our colleague Nicole over at UCI. What was the relationship of the US media to the Magonistas?
So there's, many relationships. In the beginning, largely, they were, from the mainstream press, discounted as people who were taking advantage of Mexican migrants, just trying to make money off of them through subscriptions to their newspaper. That's one phase of the story. Mexican-American journalists, on the other hand, when the Magonistas first come up, largely embrace them and give them platforms to write in before they can publish Regeneración. They republish articles from Regeneración and are largely supportive up until, closer to 1910, as Ricardo publicly admits that he's an anarchist. That changes the relationship between many Mexican-American journalists or newspapers and Ricardo Flores Magón. There's a particularly important role played by William Randolph Hearst, and I won't tell you too much about it, but William Randolph Hearst certainly tries to fan the flames of US intervention into Mexico. He wanted the United States to, invasion of Mexico. He wanted the United States to invade Mexico and basically take it over. And so he would use his newspapers to incite concerns that there was a race war happening in Mexico, and the Magonistas and organizers were sort of the center of this race war. So he plays a particularly interesting role. And of course, he has a media empire, the Hearst empire, at his disposal. So those are some of the things, but I would say that one of the most successful parts of the Magonistas movement is, even while they're in jail and in prison, they're able to get all of these Anglo-American progressives to come visit them in jail, and they give interviews, and those interviews lead these Anglo-American progressives to go do some investigative journalism in Mexico. And they publish very important articles and books that expose not just what's happening in Mexico in terms of labor relations, right? But also how much the US government had been aiding the Diaz regime north of the border to stop the discussion of life and labor in Diaz's Mexico. And it's that transition, once the Anglo-American progressives are able to move the mainstream American press to calling Diaz, a thug, right? That makes it much more difficult by 1910, 1911 for the US government to protect Diaz as the revolution begins.
Thank you so much. A follow-up question, sure.
Thank you, Dr. Lytle Hernandez. I'm like intrigued by what you just said about it being the year of the Magonistas, given the role of the press in Mexico right now. Like, does that play a part in that with the journalists who have been murdered in Baja?
I wish I had a better answer to that. I don't have an answer to that. That is a really complicated question in terms of the relationships between these various government entities and what's happening with journalists. Do you have an answer? I don't have an answer to that.
I don't. When you said it just perked my brain, because it's so tragic. Yeah. And so I'm just curious if there's a connection between that.
You know what? I don't know. I'm speaking in Mexico next week. I'll take that question to them, to some of the scholars down there, and see if we can get a good answer. So the genealogy of this is that, by the 1940s, Mexico is consecrating its revolution, right, as the center of its political identity, but also its history books, right? And so the Magonistas become part of that story, and that's how they get into the canon of Mexican history. I mean, it's been, decades at this point. And that canon was established, in many ways doesn't have a direct relationship to what's happening with the journalist, but they're often remembering what they would call precursors of the Mexican Revolution, or leaders of the Mexican Revolution. But there's a dissonance there, which you're noting.
We have another question. Dan, do you mind if I read that one? Okay, so Dan is asking, wonder about research and sources. Were there particular archives or collections that you used? Did you find any, quote, golden eggs? Which I'm not sure what a golden egg is, but it sounds like a good find.
Sounds like a smoking gun or something like that, right? So again, very blessed that so many scholars have written on the Magonistas, mainly in Mexico, but here as well and elsewhere, and was able to follow their breadcrumbs, their archival breadcrumbs. And most of those lead to the Foreign Relations Archive in Mexico City, where these stolen letters are still held today, but also where a lot of the correspondence between US and Mexican government representatives are held. So it's the SRE archive, the Archivo Diplomático in Mexico City, which is really one of the gems for this story. There's another cache of documents at UC Berkeley, and so tapped into those. And then, of course, the US National Archives, like the Department of State, Department of Justice records, is another set. But really, the heavy hitting set of documents comes from the Diplomatic Archive in Mexico City. And for me, the golden egg, I guess, are those stolen letters, because it really takes you to the front lines of the revolution. You can hear their voices, their thoughts, their relationships to one another. What you get on the pages of Hernandez is the formal politics, right? But these letters are able to take us into the back room of how do you organize a social movement and a revolution, and all the bickering that happens, the really deep political debate amongst people. There's a debate that they're having about socialism and anarchy amongst themselves. So to me, that's the richest stuff in the bunch.
Dr. Lytle Hernandez, I think Edgar Rosales has a question.
Hello, thank you very much for all the wealth of knowledge you brought. So I really thought it was really interesting. I teach modern world history, so 10th grade history. So for the most part, you know, my kids don't see this, but I do add on a certain part, and I do touch up about Diaz, and I do mention Hispano or Palo reign, and I'd lightly touch up on Pancho Villa and Zapata, and, you know, some of the female Zapatistas that also fight. I want to add more, but I know that it's difficult, and it's more of the teachers researching in. So thank you for this. And I will incorporate the Magonistas from more of the rebel. I love the Juan Crow section as well. So thank you very much for that.
You just made my heart go. Like, that's the whole point, right? Especially getting it to the hands of our young folks. So another point of this book is for everybody to see Latinx communities as drivers in American history, right? And for youth to be able to see themselves in history. And we don't have enough of that for many communities, right? But in this case, I want to make sure the Latinx youth are seeing themselves as major protagonists in the US story, and people with powerful ideas that some of the most powerful people on earth had to reckon with, right? To give us a grounding to some of the social movements that are happening, powerful social movements that are happening today. So the idea that you would teach more about the Magonistas in your classrooms, just, woo, it's very exciting. You know, we're very powerful when we know our history and whose shoulders we can rest upon.
Absolutely. And we also kind of feel a little untethered and lost when we don't. So thank you for that. We have a couple more questions. I think like the questions that I have I'm seeing here are talking really about the women. Like one is what happened to them, and then is there another woman that you would like maybe highlight? Because I know a lot of the teachers in this space would love to introduce more of the women, like the amazing her name escapes me, but the amazing one that was just like this blunt and out there with her opinions and signing anything. Yeah. Is there any more women like that you would recommend us to do some research so we can introduce to our students? And then the other question is about like whatever happened, like where did they land on their debate between anarchism and socialism?
Okay.
Two separate questions.
Yeah, so there's a wonderful book by Claudio Lomnitz, who's at Columbia University, called The Return of Comrade Ricardo Flores Magón. And one of the things that he does in that book is he provides an analysis of why we don't have more archival records on the women, the Magonistas women in particular. I think I saw someone mention, the standard constraints of the archive, right, and gender, especially, prior to recent history. And one of the things he talks about also is the literacy rates for the women who are in the movement were particularly low. So the written record that we have for them, which is, like I just said, like that diplomatic archive, all the stolen letters, really sits at the center of what we now know as the Magonista history. So in many cases, we're depending upon oral traditions about the role of women in this movement and on the voices of the few women who were writing and publishing at this time and trying to extrapolate from there. With that said, my last book, City of Inmates, I tried to develop this concept called of the rebel archive. And that's of people who are rebels themselves and what they archive, yes. But it's also a set of documents that survive intentional processes of destruction, usually by the police and by others. And so it rebels in the sense of its very survival. And there is a rebel archive for Magonistas, women, that exists in many, many places. And I do my best to pull every thread, well, many of the threads of that archive together to give us a glimpse. For example, there's a story, so there's an incident in Los Angeles when Thomas Furlong organizes a raid on a home down by the railroad tracks in what was then becoming East LA, right? And they burst into this house and they're really close to Ricardo Flores Magón. We don't really know how he escapes, but then the rumor is he jumped out of a back window and dressed as a woman, disappeared into a crowd of women, right? We have other evidence that it was a particular woman who may have been waiting outside the window and helped to get him out and conceal him. This is all rumor, but I have a strong sense that a lot of it is true. For example, there's another case where one of the Magonistas, who's not covered in the book, was being held in a jail in San Antonio for extradition. And while he was there, the US Marshals planted a spy in the jail with him, and he started talking too much, right? The spy got real close to him, he started talking too much. He said, well, the US Marshals went to my house and they broke into the house and they, broke into my desk and they almost got all of our correspondence. But my wife is so smart that she broke open the desk and took all the letters out and wrote them down to Mexico and buried them somewhere in the desert. That's extraordinary, right? So, Mama had to know where those letters were, which I participated. She's involved in this movement and she knew the cops were coming and she mobilized, right? We have these little glimpses of what the women are doing. And then of course we have Maria's own correspondence, which is pretty extraordinary. Maria threatened to assassinate Roosevelt or Diaz. So there's enough there for us to get a sense that these women were sensual, they were ballers, they were players, they were not to be fooled with, but we don't have the same depth of the written record. But so someone had said something about the movie. I think the movie needs to be about the women, right? We can write the books about the men. The movies, the TV shows needs to be about the women. And that's where we use our creative historical chops, right? To imagine what was possible from the evidence that we have.
Thank you so much. You may have noticed that Amparo put a note for everybody. We have some resources that we were hoping for you to dive into. We set aside some time. So we can introduce, what we're going to do is introduce you to those two archives. I think this will give you a sense of where Dr. Lytle Hernandez got a lot of her information, and also some great resources on the Library of Congress website that Amparo found that reveal a lot of really interesting information. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen, and then Amps, I'll turn it over to you.
Also, if you would like other resources or have some more questions for Professor Hernandez today, put them in the chat and we'll try to follow up on those as well. Like, we can, if you think of other kinds of resources, materials that you like, we'll try to explore and finding them. So
Okay.
we want to encourage you to check these out after today. And when we meet on April 27th, our wonderful teacher leader, Vanessa, is also going to give us opportunities to look at these. One of these is the Library of Congress collection from Mary Blackwell. And we believe that Mary Blackwell was a sympathizer, and she begins to document and record conversations with the Magonistas, conversations from letters and also articles that she's collected, and she transcribes them. And then the other archive is the one, the Archivo Magon from Mexico, which is like ginormous, right? And can be quite, we like to say in the project that we go down these nerdy rabbit holes. I mean, you could spend hours, so please don't forget to like eat or take care of your children, pick them up from school, because you could just like, there's so much there, you could get so engrossed. A lot of those, or most of those, are not translated into English, so I apologize for that. And that's why we also wanted to offer you this other resource from the Mary Blackwell that has the manifesto, has articles from what's happening when they are being chased in the United States, and also has a very intense depiction of the funeral and having to go back to Mexico and what happens at the funeral in Mexico, as well as more details about when they are infiltrated and what happens to their colleagues in Mexico, back in Mexico, those who are then jailed or tortured as a result of the infiltration from spies. So they're very interesting. And we think your kids would be like, whoa, right? Like would get all into these. And it really is like this, incredible drama. So these are available for you to peruse. We will share them again with you when we meet on April 27th. I assume people are perusing already, so we want to give you a couple of minutes to look through these, and then we're going to come back, and if these spur some more questions, that would be wonderful as well. And I know that was a really short time, and we apologize for that, but I mean, we have the source here today. How could we pass up on asking Professor Hernandez questions? If anybody noticed anything in what they read or what they looked at that you'd like to comment on, maybe real quick, we can have someone share, or two people.
Well, it is 5:28. So if you do have something to share, you could also put in the chat, but we are coming up towards the end of our time together here. And we want to extend an invitation to everybody to join us on April 27th, where our teacher leader, who's here with us today, Vanessa Herrera, is going to be leading us through a discussion about how we can use some of the sources that were showcased today in the classroom. So there will be an email sent out with the Zoom link and the ID, and the passcode that you see here on the screen in front of you. Really hope to see you there. I think we have one more thing to share. So you are also going to be invited to join the TPS Teachers Network. It's a great resource for teachers. Library of Congress has this set aside for history, social science teachers, and other teachers who want to use primary sources from the archives in their classroom. So you're going to be invited to join that network, and there you're going to find, it's like a community. It's like almost like social media in a way, but like in a good way, where people are, teachers are connecting with one another, putting together source sets, sharing them for public, for other teachers to engage with. So it's a really great resource. So keep a lookout for that. But once again, thank you to Dr. Kelly Lytle Hernandez for the amazing talk today on her new book, Bad Mexicans. Thank you to my colleague Amparo Chavez Gonzalez and to all you for joining us today. We hope you have a great rest of your evening.